All right, welcome to the lecture on biological organization. So, life is complex. I don't think I have to tell that to any of you. I think you're pretty aware of that. How do we understand it? How do we begin to try and look at it in a way that can help us kind of understand how living organisms are, how they interact with each other, and just the way that it all works? One way to do it is to look from the simplest level of organization and increase in complexity as we move from that first level to increasingly complex levels. This is how most textbooks approach it, so that's how we're going to approach it. So what is the simplest level of organization that we can look at with living things? Well, usually we start at the atomic level with the atom, the building blocks of matter. I've picked out a carbon atom up here because carbon is one of the most abundant elements in living things. Here's a single carbon atom with electrons, a certain number of electrons arranged a certain way. That atom of carbon is not going to operate by itself. It forms bonds to become stable with other atoms and ultimately produces molecules. Atoms are the building blocks of matter. Atoms bond together to form molecules. In this case, we have several carbon atoms that have bonded together to form this molecule. If you know it, I'm very impressed. This is glucose, type of sugar. Carbons, oxygens, and hydrogens bonded together in a certain arrangement, those atoms are, to create this molecule that has its own unique properties. So we've created a molecule from individual atoms bonded together. Well, what happens if several molecules bond together? What do we get? Well, we can get a number of things. One thing that we can get is what's called an organelle. Hopefully you recognize this term from the previous chapter, or lecture, I should say. So cellulose is the name of a chain of glucose molecules that is found within the cell walls of plants. The cell wall of plants is an outer layer that is found around their cell membrane, gives them additional structure and support. Cellulose is hard to digest. That's why we have trouble with digesting certain plants. But cellulose makes up cell walls, and cell walls are one of the organelles that makes up a plant cell. Some other organelles in a plant cell would be chloroplasts, the central vacuole, the nucleus, mitochondria. There's a lot of them. But individual atoms bond together to form molecules. Molecules are arranged in such a way that they make up organelles, like our glucose are arranged in the form of cellulose as part of the cell wall organelle. The organelles all together form a functioning cell, and we have now reached the cell level of complexity. What happens when you get a bunch of cells interacting with each other? Well, you get what are called tissues. A tissue is bunch of cells together working on a particular function. Here's a microscope image, magnified, of a intestinal tract. Up here is the lumen, or the open space of the intestine. These are called columnar cells. They line the intestinal tract. And so the remains of food will be floating through here. Nutrients will be absorbed through those columnar cells, ultimately into the bloodstream to be used by the body. Each of these are individual cells. Together, they line the digestive tract and serve the purpose of absorption of nutrients within the small intestine. So that's a tissue. That is called columnar tissue. The organ, built from several tissues, that contains these. In this case, it would be the small intestine. Small intestine is one organ that's part of a much larger organ system, the digestive system. And so organ systems consist of multiple organs performing a particular function. Digestive system is one of many systems that is found within an organism. You are an individual organism, so is Morgan Freeman. And individual organisms consist of many organ systems. We used a human as an example here, but the reality is that this hierarchy of complexity would work for virtually any species, animal, plant, etc. But when we work through all of this, we've now made our way up to the complexity level of organism. And when you look at an organism out in nature, it tends to interact with a certain other group of organisms that look somewhat like it, not identical, but somewhat like it. It tends to hang out with members of its own species. What on earth is a species? It's a great question. Sometimes it's pretty easy to tell, right? Dogs and cats, different species. This is a wolf. This is a coyote. They look pretty similar. Often when I ask in my class in person, what do they think the definition is of a species? They say organisms that are similar. Very vague, very general. And so I would ask with this picture, are these the same species, coyotes and wolves? The answer is no. But they're very, very similar, genetically and physically. But you can still tell them apart. How about these two? This is called a gray tree frog. This is called a Cope's gray tree frog. They look identical. In fact, if you were to just find one, you couldn't tell them apart. So how are they different species? Because they are. How are they not the same? They look exactly the same. Even an expert looking at them couldn't tell them apart. Well, they're not the same species because they sound different and they have different amounts of DNA. And the key here is, though, they don't mate with each other. Members of the same species are organisms that are able to reproduce with each other, that do reproduce actively with each other, and that produce offspring that are able to keep the lineage going. The offspring are fertile. So, horses and donkeys, similar. They produce mule as their offspring. But that mule is infertile, sterile. So, horses and donkeys are considered separate species. Species, group of individual organisms that can reproduce, do reproduce, and they make offspring that are able to keep lineage going. So let's take a look at one particular species. This is an African bush elephant. There's actually two species now of African elephant. This one is an African bush elephant. And there are, roughly by estimate, 415,000 of these left in the wild in Africa. So, every individual elephant, counted together in Africa, constitutes the population of that particular species. All members of a particular species form a population of that species. Here would be a small herd of elephants, part of the total population. Here is the definition of a population. All organisms of a particular species in a particular area at a particular time. All right, here is the word, or two words I should say, that I want you to focus on. Particular area. That sounds pretty vague. And it is. It can mean whatever you want it to mean. For instance, with elephants in Africa, the total population is 415,000. The population on the Serengeti Plain is 8,000. Both of those are populations of African elephant, but you're looking at different areas. If you want to think of it in terms of human terms, I live in the city of Rolla. Population of Rolla, that's the number of humans in Rolla at the time of the last census, is about 20,000. That's a human population. The population of Missouri, I actually don't know, honestly, what that is, but that would be another population. The population of the United States is about 375 million. The population of the world is about 7.5 to 8 billion. All of those are examples of the human population. Our particular area is variable. And it works that way for living things too. The key is that a population is simply the number of individuals in whatever area you want at a particular time. Now, elephants, of course, do not solely interact with members of their same species. There are many other species on the African plains that they will interact with. And within any area that has a population of one species, you'll have populations of many other species as well. And that's going to form a living community. A community, a biological community, consists of all living organisms in a particular area. And once again, a particular area is a nice, flexible term. It can mean whatever you want. In this picture, we have a biological community on the plains of Africa. Obviously, you can recognize the giraffes and the plain zebras. I want to say this is a kudu, but it might not be. It's some species of African antelope. There are several species of dove that we can see here. I'm sure there are several additional species that we can't see in this picture, as well as all of the plant, microbial, any fish life that lives in this pond, or watering hole, I should say. All of that, all of those, constitute a living community. All living things in a particular area. Let's take a look at a more familiar community, some Missouri species. So if you go walk out in our woods here, you'll notice that the dominant species that we have in terms of plant life would be oaks. In fact, the forests that we have here are what's called oak hickory forests, named for the two predominant tree species in these forests. We have several species of oaks, right? So it's not just the oak species. We have several species of oak. And hickory. This is a hickory leaf. These are the dominant trees that we have. They are the foundation of our biological community throughout much of the Ozarks. In addition to them, we have flowering plants, like this coneflower. And then we have the most abundant group of living things. They're definitely the most diverse. I don't know if they're the most abundant, but they're the most diverse. We have insects. We have a species of beetle here, feeding on the pollen of the coneflower. We have some milkweed bugs here, feeding on nectar in milkweed leaves, or milkweed flowers, I should say. All of these constitute part of our local community. You also have species that feed on dead and decaying material, like earthworms and snails. Microbial species as well, bacteria, roundworms, earthworms. You have more familiar birds, large mammals. All of these constitute a biological community that we observe here in our Ozark forests. But notice how all I've mentioned, all I've talked about here are things that are living, life forms. there are a lot of non-living things, non-living factors that influence the life that we have here in our Missouri forests. When we include non-living components of a particular area, we go beyond the community and we get into something called an ecosystem. So the ecosystem includes the non-living components that influence life in that particular area. So think about a forest here in the Missouri Ozarks, an oak hickory forest. What are some things that influence life, that impact life in that particular ecosystem? How about precipitation, temperature, soil type, fires, things along those lines? So an ecosystem includes a living community of a particular area as well as the non-living components of that area. And I've used this picture for a very specific reason. This is Indian paintbrush. It is a very colorful spring wildflower here in Missouri, and it tends to grow in places called glades. You may or may not have heard of these. I'm sure if you've gone hiking at one of our state parks, you've probably walked through one. If you're ever walking through a forest in the Ozarks here in Missouri and you come to an open area, if it's a natural area, that's probably a glade that you've walked through. Glades tend to occur on south and west facing slopes. The soil tends to be thin. There's a lot of rock exposure. There used to be a lot of fire occurrences here. Basically, trees don't grow in abundance, if at all, on a glade, which means you get a lot of sun exposure and you get a lot of wildflowers and other life that you wouldn't find in the forest because it's specialized for this particular ecosystem. All of those non-living components, the sun exposure, the orientation, southwest facing slopes, the thin soil, the rocky environment, the fires, all of those are non-living components of the glade ecosystem that contribute to the community that is found there. A community that includes wildflowers like this Indian paintbrush, which you won't find in the middle of an oak hickory forest. It needs the glade environment. Now I'm going to give you another term that is similar to ecosystem but not quite. The term is biome. So we established that an ecosystem is living and non-living components of a particular area. And if you remember from before, particular area is a variable term. Okay. A particular area can be small. Most glades are less than 30 or 40 acres in size, and a lot of them are much smaller than that. Some are only a couple acres in size. So the glade ecosystem, the particular area is pretty small. Okay. But an ecosystem can also be much larger than that. But what happens when we get several ecosystems within a particularly large area that are similar to each other, but not necessarily identical? For instance, in Missouri, we mentioned that the dominant forest type is the oak hickory forest. If you go up to Minnesota, you get what's called maple basswood forest. Different dominant tree species. You could consider these two different ecosystems, but both of them together are a type of what's called temperate deciduous forest. This simply means a forest that occurs not in the tropics, and it has trees that shed their leaves every fall. It's a pretty broad classifying term. It includes the eastern part of Missouri, going all the way east to the coast, most all of the southeast, working your way up to parts of New England. The whole eastern U.S. is dominated by temperate deciduous forests. There are other ecosystems mixed in there, like glades, like wetlands, for instance. There are patches of prairie scattered throughout. But the bulk of the eastern U.S. is temperate deciduous forest. That is going to be what's called a biome. Biome consists of large swaths of land. In this case, the entire eastern United States. Much of Europe also is this same biome. Large swaths of land, usually defined by dominant vegetation. And that is the case for the temperate deciduous forest. If you go north up into Canada, they have boreal forest, which is dominated by coniferous trees like spruce and pine. If you go to western Missouri, we have temperate grasslands, dominated by herbaceous grassy vegetation. Historically, there weren't many trees due to a number of factors, which we won't get into. But tundra, desert, tropical rainforest, all of those are examples of biomes. What if you take all of the biomes together in the entire world? Well, then you get the biosphere. This is everything. This is everything beneath the Earth's atmosphere, living and non-living. Basically, it's the whole Earth. Literally means living sphere. So we've worked our way from atoms up to the biosphere. In terms of looking at living components, since we currently don't have proof of life beyond our planet, this is about as complex as you're going to get. Let's work our way back real quick, just for illustrative sake. The biosphere consists of multiple biomes, which consist of ecosystems, living and non-living components in particular areas. Ecosystems consist of, and here's a couple pictures of some, by the way, I skipped these slides. This is the desert biome, tropical rainforest biome. I'm not sure why that's there. And here is our temperate deciduous forest biome in spring. Here are members of our living community. A community consists of all living organisms within a particular area. So the ecosystem included the non-living parts, the community just includes the living components of that area. Communities consist of populations, which are groups of members of similar species. So communities consist of populations of many different individuals. Populations are built from individual organisms that belong to certain species. Organisms are built from organ systems, which are built from organs, built from tissues. And we're worked our way all the way back to tissues built from cells, built from organelles, molecules, and then atoms. So you can look at it two different ways. You can look at it from the simplest to the most complex, or you can work backwards from the biosphere down. Whatever helps you understand, go with that one. But that is, in a nutshell, biological organization.